Okay, so the slides are being shown.
Stephen, are you in the Jitsi channel?
Yes.
So you can direct people here if they...
I can via text, but not audio, of course, but I only have so many bits of audio.
Right.
But yes, there's no one else there.
Great.
So I also have there's a meeting notes. The note-taking tool is on the top panel, the fourth from the left button.
Mm-hmm.
I just cut and pasted the agenda into that, and then we'll just very shortly try and see if we can get a victim to help take notes, but otherwise I can help with notes.
Great.
So speaking of which, if there's people are starting to join now, if anybody wants to do a quick audio check, now's a good time.
Hello.
Yep, great, works fine. Again, anybody else, just jump in if you want to do a quick audio check. And if anybody's willing to help take some meeting notes, that would be appreciated. Please just let us know. I'll be doing some of that, so you won't be alone. Don't all fall over each other volunteering. There's a meeting notes, a note-taking tool that's associated with the with MidEcho. It's on the top pane, the kind of fourth from the left, and we can do it collaboratively.
Good morning. Test.
Hi Neil, how are you?
Hey.
Thank you, Karsten. And this is our agenda. We give people a couple more minutes to join and chairs to get organized. Okay, again, anybody wants to do a quick audio check? A couple of minutes to do that still. And if you're willing to help take notes, please let me know. We're using the note-taking tool that's built into MeetEcho, which is kind of easy to use. Okay, since DKG will be mostly doing the speaking, I'll try and take notes. So let's start at 5 past.
That sounds right to me. Stephen, you still have control over the slides.
I do. Pardon me. I'm about to give it to you. Yeah, it's all yours. It's about to be all yours.
Got it. Yep. I see the controls.
So how long have we got? We're here. We have an hour for this, or did we allocate longer?
It's actually scheduled for 2, but I'm hoping that we don't need to take the full 2.
Right. Okay. So yeah, just for people's planning, I think if we can get done around about the top of the hour, that'd be good, I think. So just in case people don't know, the convention here is like when an IETF meeting's in place. So if you want to say something, you can put up your hand and join the queue. If just under your name at the top left of the screen, there's a join queue kind of hand symbol that you can click like I just did, and then you appear at the top of the roster and we can call on you. If we have 1 or 2 people having a discussion on a particular point, we don't necessarily need to use the queue, but generally please do use the queue because it's kind of fairer to everybody. I guess 5 past DKG, so why don't we fire ahead?
Sounds good. As this is a IETF meeting, the note well still applies. Just as a reminder here, you've probably read these things when you've been in previous IETF meetings. I think I know most of the people who are in attendance, but just as a reminder, this is an IETF meeting. Please make sure that your video and audio are off unless you are chairing or presenting. Or speaking, obviously, once you're in the queue. And if you're speaking, we recommend using a headset because otherwise we get feedback loops. One more administrative reminder, we have a code of conduct here about being courteous, speaking clearly and slowly, and using reasoned arguments. We're looking for the best solutions here and working together in a group. I think folks should be fine with that. The baseline agenda is here. It was published earlier and sent to the mailing list. There's been some discussion of several of these points on the mailing list. All of them have been raised individually in separate threads on the mailing list, and hopefully we can have those discussions on those threads clearly to document. I would hope that we can have a chance during this meeting to just clarify the specific details. These are the major substantive changes that are proposed and outstanding for the refresh. Does anybody want to add anything to the agenda or remove anything from the agenda or change it in some way?
Just a note, we forgot to say the meeting is being recorded, so that's happening. You should see a little recording button on the bottom. And I guess my note on this agenda is I hope that if we manage to figure out all these topics, that we then manage to get this document out of the working group very, very soon. That's my goal, because the longer it kind of hangs around and the more issues we find, we'll just end up with an infinite kind of never getting finished kind of mode, which is bad. So hopefully we try and decide these things today if possible and move the document along.
Yes, agreed. However, we also do need to make sure that those conclusions are posted publicly to the list. And so if you reach any special insight today, or you just realize that you have a clear opinion one way or the other on these things, and you choose to express it on the list, that would be much appreciated, because activity on the list is where the formal working group decisions are made.
And thank you to whoever is taking notes in the note tool. Please feel free to identify yourself so we can thank you properly.
Okay, so I'm going to carry on because I have not seen any. There's also a chat function here. If you are trying to speak and it doesn't work, you can use the chat function, and we'll keep an eye on that too. So just to move on to the first item in the agenda, we discussed this at the IETF 115, whether we should rename keys, signatures, and one-pass signature packets from V5 to V6. This avoids a conflict with some already deployed code from GNU-PG that are doing things that are not currently in the specification. During the meeting at IETF 115, no one seemed to be really happy about this, but no one seemed to actually object to it either. It seems like this might be the way forward to avoid some serious interop confusion. While I was writing up the notes for this, it occurred to me that there's this prefix octet that's used that's different for different version keys, and there's a question of whether we change it as well from 9A to 9B. You'll find in the merge request that's there, it points to merge request 231, that I did change from 9A to 9B. As the slide says, there's an additional question about whether we want to move PKESK and SKESK to V6 so that everything in this draft all has the same version numbers except for the SEIPD, which is V2. And the merge request does not actually currently move PKESK and SKESK to V6, although we could update it to do that. So I would like to hear from folks who are whether they still think this is a good idea. There seemed to be a consensus in the room in 115 that this was a good idea. Now there's a merge request for it. I don't know whether anybody has had a chance to take a look at the merge request to see whether it looks right to them, or whether anybody has any new objections to this change. Jonathan, you're in the queue.
Just to fess up that I am one of those people who has shipped code that supports the v5 format, as supported by DPG. ONAC added the support back in 2019 based off the test key that was sent to the OpenPGP mailing list. So I have a vested interest that we don't get the incompatibility and that we do move to v6 for something that is essentially a different format.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. That's good feedback.
So I don't see people joining the queue. Well, I think we do need to decide this. So can we ask it the other way around? Does anybody object to using v6? If you object to using v6, please do join the mic line now. Okay, so it looks like nobody wants to object to using v6. And I guess, should we just check your last bullet separately, PKG?
Yeah, let's ask that as a separate question here.
Okay, so then just for the PKESK and SKESK, does anybody object to moving those to v6?
So if we're going to move those to v6, we will need another merge request made for that. I'm assuming that I haven't heard any complaints about the 9A to 9B prefix octet transition as well. Folks' lack of feedback isn't super convincing, because maybe you're all just asleep. It's early for me, but it would be good to have some positive affirmation here. I see something in the chat. Neil, you're in the queue. Go ahead.
Yep, I'm definitely for moving to v6 and the other two things. Positive confirmation.
Great.
Thank you. Okay, so it sounds to me like folks here have are for making this change, and we've heard no objections. So I'm going to move forward. I will put as a to-do item for myself to make a merge request for the PKESK and SKESK to v6 on top of the existing 231. Unless somebody else wants to
I guess just formally, we'll post the meeting minutes to the list, and then people can still object on the list because that's where the decisions get made. But barring objections arising on the list, I think that we have a plan.
Yep. And if somebody else wants to volunteer to do the PKESK, SKESK to v6 merge request on top of 231, I would welcome it, but I'm not holding my breath.
Don't hold your breath. I think we want to get it done quickly, and right now you probably would be the quickest, I think.
Okay. The next item on the list, this was raised in issue 130 by Demi-Marie Obenauer. Demi-Marie observed that in the current specification, which is shown in the table here, when you are making a v5 signature, which will now, of course, be called a v6 signature, assuming that we go through with that change, it is entirely possible for a signature made from a v5 key to be made over the exact same data that would have been made for a v3 signature, but the data would be interpreted differently. So what we see in this table here is the suffix of the string of data that is hashed for a signature for different versions. So in a v3 signature, these blocks here are broken up by octets. So in a v3 signature, the last 4 octets are a signature timestamp, and the octet before that is a signature type, and before that is all of the signed data, so the document that was signed. A v4 format appends a trailer to the signed data, and then the 0x04 octet, and then 0xFF, and then a 4-octet length of the trailer itself that was appended to the signed data. So this cannot be aliased with a v3 signature unless the v3 signature was of type 0xFF, which is not defined. For v5, which we've added in the current draft, it uses an 8-octet trailer length instead of a 4-octet trailer length. And the trouble here is that most trailers are significantly less than 2 to the 32 bytes, which means that the 5th octet from the end will be 0, which means that the actual signed data will basically be a timestamp, will look like a v3 signature. The thing that's signed can be transformed into a v3 signature where the length of the trailer is transformed into a timestamp and the signature type is 0. It is possible with an insane signature to have the trailer length be slightly more than 2 to the 32 octets, in which case the 5th octet from the end would be a 1, which would alias to a v3 signature of type 1. Signatures of type 0 and 1, of course, are binary and text mode signatures. So this is an issue because it means that if you are signing things with what are currently called v5 keys, what will be v6 keys, go forward with that, your signatures can be transformed into a subtly different signature over a v3 signature over subtly different data. That is, the signed data and the trailer will be merged together, and it will look like a v3 signature. We don't know what the consequences of that will be, but it seems like not a great property of the crypto system if people are still validating v3 signatures. So the proposal currently is to revert v5 signatures from using an 8-octet field to a 4-octet field, and that's in merge request 220. The result would be that the 0xFF de-aliases v5 and v4 from v3. That merge request explicitly has, it says you must not define a signature of type 0xFF and you must not validate a signature of type 0xFF to ensure that the de-aliasing works. And there's some discussion on that merge request about whether this is safe to do or not. In the possibility that a trailer is greater than 2 to 32 octets. I believe there's reasoning on there that demonstrates that there is no risk of aliasing if the trailer length wraps, but I have not heard anybody give feedback or confirm with that. So does this make sense? If people don't understand it, please ask questions. If you feel like you do understand it and you have an opinion on whether this change should be made or not, please weigh in. I can also, Andrew, you're in the queue. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm just wondering, I didn't see anything like this on the ticket, but I'm just wondering that since as Jonathan said earlier, the V5 signatures are already implemented in the wild, is there a danger of there being aliasing the other way? So, for example, can we ensure that nothing created using the current draft spec could possibly be aliased to a future format, including V6 potentially?
This is the problem with implementing pre-specified things. This was not found until relatively recently. Any signatures that are made by the implementations that use the unspecified V5 are indeed aliasable to V3, which means you can change the signature type to a binary signature and just have a weird suffix running off the end of the data. So, this is a good reason not to use the what people have implemented so far, but I don't think we can make that. We can't fix that. What we can fix are the things that are specified.
Sure, but the question is that given that it is already, given that that horse is bolted, so that's kind of out of the bag already. Can we do something with V6 and future keys to make sure that whatever has already been implemented as V5 is not aliasable to V6 or V7 or whatever? Like, is there guidance for that?
So what is implemented right now is not aliasable to V6. if we do this change to V6, if we make this change so that V6 reverts to the 4-octet width field, then there is no way that a V5 signature is aliasable to V6, because the V5 signature, as it is currently specified, would have a either a 0 or a 1 in the 5th octet from the end. And what we are doing here is we would guarantee that the 5th octet from the end is a 0xFF. It cannot be a 0 or a 1. And there's no way for a V5 signature, even over a very large signature, the largest possible signature, for it to change that 5th octet to anything but 0 or 1. So as long as, we can't, if people want to implement arbitrary things that are unspecified, we can't ensure a de-aliasing there. And V5, as it's currently implemented, will indeed be aliasable to V6, to V3. But it will not, the specification in merge request 220 explicitly says, you must always keep the 5th octet from the end to 0xFF, and the 6th octet from the end to be the version number for everything above version 3. And so that is it includes explicit documentation to future specifiers how to avoid de-aliasing, how to avoid the aliasing for future versions. Does that make sense?
Perfect, thanks.
So I'm going to try to run a poll on this because I'm not convinced that people necessarily understand it. It took me a long time to understand it. And even writing up this slide, I felt like it changed my understanding of it. So revert trailer length field for E6 signatures to 4 from 8 octets to 4 octets. So this is so if you look in the poll, I've got a poll here that says revert trailer length field for V6 signatures from 8 octets to 4 octets. So please click raise hand if you want this to happen. Click do not raise hand if you think this is a bad idea. And if you don't feel like you understand this, just leave your hand, don't click either of them. So I'm seeing hands raised in favor of the reversion, and I'm not seeing any hands raised. I'm not seeing anyone clicking do not raise hands. So I'm going to end this session. It seems to have stabilized at 7:0. Stephen, do you think we should run another poll that says I understand this? Or we had 7 people saying that they understood it from a group of 15 participants.
No, I think we're okay.
Okay.
I guess it's worth checking. Does anybody want to kind of speak to, requiring more time, or, it's not being explained sufficiently? I as you know, DKG, my brain has kind of unbuffered everything to do with OpenPGP in the last few weeks, so I understood it. I suspect others did too. So, but we should give people a chance to express a need for more information if necessary. Again, bearing in mind that we still want to get done. So, but if anybody thinks they need more information about this, now is a good time to join the mic line.
Okay. Seeing no further confirmation, we got positive feedback on the poll, so I'm going to move on to the next slide here. So, with the length of the salt. So Aaron Whistler raised this concern. He sent his regards and regrets that he was not able to be here. So I'm hopefully representing this proposal correctly. The question here is about the length of the salt in the V6 signatures. Aaron's concern is that some post-quantum algorithms will want more than 16 octets of salt. And the current specification for the V6 signatures says they have a fixed 16 octets. The proposal here is to bind the salt size to the hash algorithm used in the signature. And it recommends this merge request 219 has this implementation, and it also indicates the salt size on the wire instead of leaving it up to each implementation to record that. I believe that change was made in response to Justus Winter's concern that he wants to be able to parse a signature even if he doesn't know anything about the hash algorithm. This, of course, raises the question of what happens if someone makes a signature with the wrong size, with the wrong size algorithm, and this merge request says we should reject the signature if it's made with a hash that doesn't match the salt size. I imagine that's going to require a bit of testing to make sure that people actually do reject signatures based on that, but it says clearly what to do in the spec at least. And the one outstanding question in that merge request is whether we should specify a salt size for hash algorithms that we do not expect signatures to happen anyway. I'd like to hear people speak to this. If people feel like this is something that is necessary, if they feel like it is unnecessary, how they feel about the salt size being on the wire or not, and what, if we do go ahead with this, what should the salt size be for SHA-1 and MD5?
While people are thinking, DKG, just a clarifying question for me. When you say a change on the wire, does that mean that nobody has implemented this so far to put the salt size in the packets?
None of the packets currently have the salt size embedded in them.
Okay.
And so this change would mean that all current signatures are, signatures that have been made from current implementations would not be valid because the first octet of the salt will be treated as a size indicator. Falco, you're in the queue.
And so for the salt size for deprecated hash algorithms, I think the simplest solution would just be to make it the minimum length, which is, I think, 16 octets. Okay,
that's what the current merge request does. It seems like we could also put a not applicable in that field and say, if you're making V6 signatures, it should not be made over SHA-1 or MD5. Don't do this. And then all those signatures would by definition fail because they don't match the recommended hash algorithm. So those seem like the two options that would be reasonable. I guess you could also do a 0, but that doesn't. Zero feels wrong to me as well. So I think your proposal is one of the two reasonable options that we have. Is there a reason, Falco, that you would want to do that instead of saying not applicable?
Not necessarily, no. I don't really have an opinion which one is preferable.
Okay. Thanks for weighing in. Are there any objections to the fact that the wire format is going to change with this for a V6?
So I was going to ask that. I mean, we're at a pretty late stage of the process, and I would hope there would be a kind of a high bar to changing the wire format.
Well, we're changing the wire format by moving from V5 to V6 anyway. There is a wire format change.
Yeah, nonetheless, with every additional change, possibly creates some other issue that somebody raises later that causes us to hit an infinite loop. So I think it'd be great if people support making this wire format change and indicating the salt size. I think that if they speak to supporting that, I think that would be useful. Justus.
So I requested the explicit size, and the reason is that we want to be able to robustly parse the signature even if you don't know the hash algorithm. Then, if you don't know the hash algorithm, you don't know the size. So it's better to have it explicit.
So your audio was a little bit scratchy for me, at least, Justice, but I think I heard you supporting making this change, because so that you can skip over it more easily. Correct me if I'm wrong in the chat or on audio, whichever.
And just as the maintainer of the interoperability test suite, would you be up for adding tests that would confirm signatures are rejected if they don't match, if the hash sizes don't match?
And yes, he says in the chat.
Okay, that's great. And Justus, do you have an opinion on what we should specify for the for deprecated hash algorithms? I see Daniel saying he's in favor of the change in the chat as well.
Which is good to know. I mean, again, I'm wary of the logic that since we're changing something, we can change another thing. But
so Andrew Gallagher weighs in favor of deprecated being set to NA. That is not currently in the merge request, so that might be something for some recommended changes.
would you? I guess we may have gotten opinions. Would you care to summarize what you think the answers to the 3 questions on the slide are, and then we can take that to the list?
So far, I'm hearing, I think, that people are in favor of indicating the salt size on the wire, specifically for the reason that Justus articulated. I don't believe anyone has objected to rejecting signatures if the salt size on the wire doesn't match the expected size for the algorithm itself. And the only person I've heard voicing a strong opinion that he has maintained on the salt size for deprecated hash algorithms is Andrew Gallagher for not applicable. Falco suggested you could just use the minimum one, and then said, but I don't have an opinion on it. So I'm going to move on to the next slide.
Right, what was the answer to the last one there? Sorry.
The only person who's voiced an opinion has been Andrew Gallagher, suggesting that the deprecated hash algorithms should have not applicable in this column.
And do we, is that something that other people agree with? Or, I mean, I'd like, if we can bottom out and get it saying, here's if we can say that, this interim meeting at least had an answer that was acceptable to people, that would be good, I think.
Okay.
So Andrew, I guess I'm asking, is Andrew's answer acceptable to people, or do people object to it? Nobody's objecting. So
I'm going to run a poll right now, where you're going to raise your hand for choosing not applicable, and you're going to choose do not raise hand if you want 16 octets, and you're not going to choose anything if you don't understand the question. So here's the poll. The salt size for deprecated hash algorithms. Raise your hand if you think it should be not applicable, and do not raise hand if you think it should be 16 octets. Okay, seems to be stabilized. We have 6 folks weighing in favor, and Daniel has volunteered to update the PR to change that since Aaron is currently on vacation. So I'm going to end that poll. Thank you, Daniel, for volunteering to update the PR. I hope that goes into the minutes. I think that's we have a pretty clear sense that that's the way forward. Next slide here. Context signatures, context parameter for signatures. So we have proposed context parameters from a threads started by Marcus Brinkman for both signing and for encryption. We've been going through signing steps here, and I'd like to focus specifically on the context parameter for signatures. The next slide is for context parameter for encryption. So I'd like to focus on them separately because I do think they are separate questions. The answers may be the same. It is not clear to me whether we want to include a context parameter explicitly here or not. If we do, it's not clear how the signer who's making a signature knows what the context parameter should be. And yes, v5 should be read as v6. Daniel, you're in the queue. Go ahead. Sorry, I took you out of the queue, but I meant for you to go ahead. I thought you would. Can you turn on your own audio? I think you have to turn it on yourself.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay, sorry
Yes.
about that. Yeah, so so for signing specifically, technically it's possible to get domain separation using notation data subpackets, right? I think you brought this up at some point. We could, if we want to bind a signature to a specific application and make sure it can be used, it can't be used elsewhere, then you could add a critical notation data subpacket, and then when verifying, check that it's there, for example. And we have some support for that in our implementations, but it's still a very manual thing that you have to do, right? You have to manually add the notation data subpacket, which we don't have great support for. We could add that and then check that it's there when verifying. And it's possible, but in my opinion, kind of slightly hacky solution to the problem. And it also, nobody's really doing that at the moment. I think the advantage of adding an explicit context parameter for this, in my mind, is to encourage new applications to use it. Because if we had, for example, in our OpenPGP implementations, a top-level context parameter for signing, verifying, encryption and decryption, although we will get to that later, but then it's quite obvious that it's something you can do and probably should do, right? Whereas adding notation data subpackets kind of isn't. Of course, we could add more high-level APIs for that using notation data subpackets, but I think that it would be good to, at the spec level, encourage encourage applications to use domain separation. Yeah, that's essentially my position.
Thank you, Daniel. Can you speak a little bit to how that would work with existing deployments? My concern here is that the elevated API, the more visible context field, as you said, would encourage people to use it. And then for implementations that can't decide on what to use, that it would produce interoperability failures, signatures that could not be verified because for a non-greenfield implementation, there's no consensus on what the value of the context parameter would be. Can you speak a little bit to how that would play out?
Right. So I think it's very specific to each existing application, right? So for email, there was this concrete proposal to add a header, which would signal that the context parameter should be used, although that proposal was focused on encryption, but I think the same could be used for signing, right? And then for other applications, I would imagine that you also need some kind.
Hold on. The header would signal whether the context should be used for that message. But when
Right.
you're composing the message, you have to decide whether to do that. So there's two kinds of signaling. One is was a context parameter used, and the other one is should I use a context parameter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you might. So if we build this parameter into v6 signatures, then you would at least be able to know that when using v6, the implementation has to support it, right? I'm not necessarily saying that that automatically means that when using v6, that means that you can use it in like every existing application, but that's what at the email level, that's what we could decide, right? But
What would we decide at the email level?
that's when sending messages to a v6 key, for example, or when generating v6 signatures, that you would use this context parameter and send a header to indicate that it was used, for example.
And what would you put as the value? Because the critical thing with the context parameter is that signatures will not verify if you do not know what the context parameter is, right?
Right.
So what would you put in this? When I'm trying to verify the signature, what would I put in the context parameter?
So the proposal for email specifically was to have a header that says which of the other headers to put there.
Right.
So you could have like the sender, the recipient, the date header, maybe the message ID. I don't know exactly what they proposed, but you would, compile those, let's say, into the context parameter.
Right. But so hold on. You're describing a complex scheme that's described in this paper, right?
Yes, but my point
are
is,
you proposing folding that into this specification so that
no,
you cannot make these 6
explicitly the
signatures in
opposite.
email without this?
No, I'm explicitly saying like that should be discussed in the context of email and not here in the. I mean, that shouldn't go into the OpenPGP spec.
I agree with you that is a whole large ball of wax that we don't want to roll in here.
Right.
So my question to you is, what are you going to do when you send an email?
My answer is we should discuss that in the context of email.
But if we roll this out and v6 signatures require a context parameter, people who are applying a v6 signature to their email messages are going to have to make a decision about what to do.
Yeah.
And what are they going to do?
By default, if we don't discuss anything in the context of email, then you would put the empty string as the context parameter and
Okay,
not
so now
send the
some
header.
emails are going to be out there with the empty string as a context, and some are, and then in the future some are not.
I think for an existing application, that's kind of unavoidable, right?
Well, this is what I'm asking. How do we deal with when you're making the signature, knowing what context parameter to include?
Yeah, I think you'll have to define it at the at the application level. If the application doesn't say anything, then you just put the empty string.
Right, and then once it's defined for an application like email,
Mm-hmm.
you put whatever the context string is.
Mm-hmm. Plus a header saying
But-
that you're using it.
And how do you know whether to do that or not?
I mean, once at the application level, we define that this is a thing that you can do, right? I mean, then of course, email applications will have to work to support that. And then,
And they'll be dealing with an archive of messages that don't have it.
yes, indeed. I mean, again, like we could say in the context of email that we bind it to v6, right?
So you cannot make a
but-
v6 signature until somebody has gone ahead and specified exactly what this should be.
Well,
So
you still.
I just as a slight interrupt. I think we're beginning to start to head towards going around in circles. I think. I think I understand the choice here myself. So I'd be interested if other people want to weigh in. I understand DKG's hesitance. I understand the desire that Daniel has. Both seem valid. Are there other people who'd like to weigh in on this topic as to whether this is something to include in V6 or this is something, I guess, to punt to a mail specification later? I think those are the two choices. Is that roughly right? Neil?
Yeah,
I kind of agree with DKG to be conservative here, and I kind of like the notation thing. The fact that it's not part of high-level APIs seems to be an API problem and not a spec problem.
So Neil, you're basically arguing to say that this is better addressed later in an email spec.
Yep, I agree.
Well,
okay, and
to be clear,
Daniel, I thought you wanted to jump in as well.
I think Daniel's goal is to have domain separation between email and other domains. So it wouldn't just be addressed in the email spec, but I think what Neil is saying here is that you can do this outside of the email or across other domains via this other mechanism.
Right.
So if we wanted for email, we would need to also specify a separate thing. Anybody else want to weigh in on this?
So I think, Daniel, did you want to respond to something there?
Yes, I just indeed. I mean, DKJ sort of said it already, but I don't think it necessarily makes sense to postpone this, postpone the whole topic to an email spec. My point was that we should postpone how to use it for email to an email spec. But I think having a context parameter in the OpenPGP spec so that we can use it in email and other applications would be great. And then that also, I think it would be a good step towards being able to use it in applications. It's true that technically speaking, we can already do that using notation data subpackets, but I don't agree that that's a better solution. Also, because to use that, you need to put the actual context string in the signature, right? In order for it to go in the hash. Whereas here, the idea of the context parameter is to just add it to the hash directly without having it in the signature packet, which obviously saves bytes. Okay, that's not a huge concern, but the other risk of putting it in a notation data subpacket is just to is that people will just verify the signature without actually knowing what the context is, right? Having an actual context parameter basically forces you to actually compute it from the headers or whatever the context is, right? Which I think is better.
Sure, and I think that the tension is between wanting that context parameter essentially out of band in order to make cross protocol attacks harder, versus not knowing what to put in there at the beginning and having people who are verifying signatures go wrong later or have archives of signatures that no longer verify.
Right.
I think that's the tension, right? Okay, so any other voices? People who would, I think it'd be good to get more voices on this. So please do chime in if you have an opinion based on the discussion. Andrew.
Hi. Okay, this is a bit left field, but it suddenly occurred to me there, listening to the discussion, that we could have a third way in between the two, which doesn't specify an actual context parameter in the definition of the signature, but we use the notation subpacket as previously discussed. But you could then subsequently mangle the signature to make the notation subpacket, the explicit notation subpacket in the signature, unreadable. And then you would have to reconstruct that again using a similar procedure before you could verify the signature. Now that would be that probably comes under the heading of abuse of spec, but I just thought it was worth throwing in.
If you want to make it unreadable, you could also put a hash of the context in a notation data subpacket.
Okay, Jonathan, just getting new voices.
I'm not clear I really see the benefit in a separate context packet. I don't understand what we get over the notation subpacket. If we want to particularly say this is a context we're using, can we not then have a particular flag in it? I think from looking at the spec, we only define human readable in the notation flag registry. So why can't this just be a different type of notation, right? Like an application context or something under the existing packet type.
And so, Jonathan, just to be clear, then, so that what you're suggesting there would not require the context string to be actually in the packet, just an indicator that there exists a context string somewhere. Is that correct?
What I'm suggesting is we would use the existing notation subpacket, and we would potentially define a new flag registry first octet of the notation subpacket would allow us to say this is a context. I mean, you're getting down to something that is very much application specific, right? This is an application problem really than a protocol level problem. So you're relying on interoperation from all applications to understand that, hey, this signature can only be used in this context. That doesn't feel like it deserves a new subpacket or a context parameter on it. It feels like it's a notation because things can't ignore it, right? There's no cryptographic verification in there about the actual thing. It's a notation to the application. So I don't see the value that a separate context parameter adds.
I mean, the proposal here is exactly to get some cryptographic verification of that by adding the context into the hash that goes into the signature, right? So you're forcing each application to know the context, which could be as simple as just like the name of the application, right? In order to verify its own signatures that it made to ensure that it indeed made them itself. That's kind of the goal.
Falco, please join.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is a simple example that just came to my mind. So if I have a backup application that puts in a context parameter with its own name, and then I verify the backup, the encrypted backup file on the command line will mean that I cannot verify my own signature, right?
Your
Yeah,
command
you
line.
have to pass it indeed somehow, the context parameter.
I would
Right.
see
This
that
does
as a potential problem.
it implicates an API, a significant API change to what OpenPGP signature looks like. There's an additional parameter that would be passed to signature making and signature verification. So I'm inclined to start a show of hands here. I want to highlight.
One sec, DKG, just before we do that.
Yep.
So there's a similar issue with respect to encryption. Should
That's
we
right. But
discuss?
I think
My question is, should we discuss that before doing a poll on one or two polls on both, or should we have a poll now on signatures and then only discuss encryption? A lot of the issues are the same.
Well, they're not exactly, because there is this
Not exactly.
difference. Well, I can hold off on the poll if you'd rather hold off on the poll. That's fine.
As a suggestion, I think let's poll, like, do one or two polls about these topics after the second one is discussed as well, perhaps, if that's okay.
Sure. Okay, so
keep your opinions to hand about signatures, and let's talk about encryption.
So we have the same question for encryption. Should we make encryption and decryption contingent on the encryptor and decryptor both agreeing on a context beforehand, or outside of the actual decryption? So we have one merge request that actually covers both of these, which is merge request 214. It is still unclear from the merge request how a signer knows what context parameter to use. The idea here is that encryption and decryption would require a context parameter, and your decryption would fail if you did not include it. And this would be for SCIPD version 2 encryption only. We would not be able to include the context parameter for the earlier, already specified SCIPD version 1. It is subtly different here than signatures. Daniel, you want to speak up?
Yeah, just to say that for encryption, there is currently no way to rigorously provide domain separation, since there's not an equivalent thing to the notation data subpackets, right? I mean, there's basically no way to get something into the additional data of the encryption, and even if you put something in the body, there's no guarantee that I mean, however you structure the body, someone else could have encrypted a message with that structure, right? So either accidentally by encrypting a specific file or whatever. So just to say that I think for encryption it's yeah, possibly even more important. Not sure, but yeah.
And so, Daniel, maybe maybe you could speak again. Do you feel like this is the same situation that it would be in terms of greenfield versus non-greenfield? That we would basically be saying that there's a similar signaling choice?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's basically the same situation here.
Neil, go ahead.
So I haven't read Marcus's paper or the group's paper, but I'm deeply worried about the usability concerns. This is going to make everything so much more complicated, and it's already so hard to use encryption at all.
Can you describe what you mean by complicated. Are you thinking it's complicated for implementers, that it'll be complicated for users? What's the... Can you give examples of the kind of failures that you're expecting?
I think Falco gave a really good example beforehand with the having to verify a message on the command line. All of a sudden you have to provide this additional context parameter by hand.
Daniel, go ahead.
I think there's a sort of underlying philosophical question here about who is OpenPGP for, right? Is it an API for developers, or is it an API for end users? Or not an API, but like, do we expect indeed users to take a signature from a backup application and then manually verify that OpenPGP signature on the command line or with some OpenPGP implementation? Or do we primarily want to design OpenPGP as something that can be used by applications to encrypt stuff, right? And I think currently OpenPGP is maybe more focused on end users in that sense, which I think makes it a poor fit for applications trying to use OpenPGP. And I think in the end, if applications use OpenPGP and provide the interface for the user to decrypt their data and so on, in the end, I would say the usability will be better. And we shouldn't expect users to take out a signature from a backup application and then manually try to verify it somehow. But I agree that if that is a use case that we want to serve, then this will complicate it somewhat.
So Neil, I think you're actually in the queue first, so go ahead and then Falco.
Right, so I understand Daniel's point, but what I'm concerned about is that applications die, and I still want to be able to access my data years later. And then there's the interoperability concern. Like, are all applications sort of getting it right?
Okay, thanks. Falco?
Yeah, that would be my concern too. And moreover, in the backup example, it could be that even the application uses the path to the original files as context, which I might lose at some point. So it could be really obscure what I have to put there. And concerning encryption, I think I really support the idea of having a context because it defeats some very dangerous attacks that are out there for a long time, are known for a long time, and should be defeated. But I think it should be something that is optional. I don't think there's a way to introduce this, a solid way to introduce this, requiring the context parameter coming from outside. I think a context parameter for decryption that travels with a message would be at least for phasing in and maybe permanently would be a good idea.
Okay, Justus?
So I'm also concerned about the complexity this brings to APIs. So we have existing APIs, for example, Gmime. And if we would need to pass in somehow a context parameter, we would need to change all the APIs throughout the whole application and library stack. in order to make that work.
Okay, so very roughly, I think what I've heard so far is Daniel giving good arguments for including these kind of context parameters, but a bunch of people pushing back for slightly different reasons. I guess I'm wondering does anybody, aside from Daniel, want to argue for these context parameters being included now according to the MR, the merge request? So DKJ, I think you're muted.
Thanks. So I can do two polls. One is, should we add a context parameter to V6 signatures? And the other one would be, should we add a context parameter to SEIPD v2 encryption?
So let me tweak your poll questions. I think
Sure.
the question is, should we add a context parameter now?
In this draft.
Yeah. So in the next, should we accept this merge request? Essentially, I think it comes out. There's clearly people see some benefits to context parameters, but introducing them is tricky. Maybe we don't have maybe somebody will figure out a great way to do that introduction a little bit later on, perhaps. I can't remember who made a kind of a third route suggestion in the signature discussion. But I think the question is, should we do this now, or should we kind of leave this to be something that we try and revisit? Because clearly there's some interest in doing it. But how to do it well and introduce it well seems to be the hard part.
Yep.
Daniel?
So, just one last minute comment, if I may. I think the question of how to introduce it is an application question. So I think that's something that needs to be discussed in the context of, for example, email. And if we don't add it here in the spec, then we can't introduce it in email, right? And so I don't quite agree that the order of things should be that we first figure out how to introduce it and make it usable in email, for example, and then add it to the spec, because we can add it to the spec and it can be optional, and we can just leave it empty for email and every existing application, in fact, if we don't want to use it, and then new applications can use it, and then we can start to think about how to introduce it in email, right? In my opinion.
So I
Daniel,
think
I think I would kind of agree, except with one part of what you said. I mean, I think it is true that introducing these kind of context parameters in email is hard to do, but it's also hard to do in the general case, as is suggested by this merge request. There are difficulties associated with doing it now as well.
And I would actually argue that it is not solely an application layer question, because each application layer will need to define some sort of mechanism to know whether or not to use it. If it's totally greenfield, it doesn't, but existing applications do. A signaling mechanism is something that OpenPGP's, I believe the certificate is the place where you would do that signaling. And so I'm inclined to say that the place to do the signaling is in this spec, so that at least applications can know whether or not, like, they can know how to make the signaling happen, right? Because your goal is to signal something for, at least for encryption, you need to know how to do the, you're encrypting to a key, right? You need to know whether or not that key knows how to handle the context parameter.
Not just the key, but also the application, right? So if you're assuming that the key is only used by one application, then you don't actually need this domain separation at all. Because, okay, I mean, using one key per application is, in fact, another way to achieve domain separation. If we want to say that you should only use one key per application, that's also a reasonable answer. The advantage of having an explicit parameter for domain separation is that you can use the same key that you fetch from WKD for different applications, right? So then you can't necessarily put the signaling in the key because you want to know whether the specific application is capable of using the context parameter.
Neil, go ahead.
Bill, you're in the queue.
So you said we can't use the same key. That's only half true, Daniel, because we have subkeys and then we have key capabilities. And one thing that we've been thinking about a bit is adding different like encryption backends. So for matrix or for MLS or age, and then one would indicate that by using a different flag in the, what are they called? The key capabilities, or the SCET, thing like that.
I think it's called key usage
Thank
or
you.
key flags, or the usage. It's called both because OpenPGP always has terrible terminology. Yusuf?
Yusuf?
Or indeed, you can have a notation in binding signature for sub.
I couldn't understand what you said there, Eustace. Maybe you want to
Say
try
it.
repeating it either louder or in text.
Have a notation in the subkey binding signature.
Have a notation in the subkey binding.
Signature, yeah.
Okay.
So,
So DKG, do you
Jonathan,
want to propose a poll then? Okay.
yeah, let me just try to raise Jonathan McDowell's question from the chat as well. He says, I'm not clear if the intent is to keep the data secret unless you know the context, or just prevent an application from decrypting, verifying something that was encrypted signed in a different context. So, Jonathan, I think the goal is the latter. These context parameters were proposed in the context of people munging existing encrypted data, passing it to a mail user agent with the hopes that the end user's mail user agent will decrypt it and then do dangerous things with it. Go ahead and speak.
If the intent is application cooperation and ensuring non-misuse of signed data, then there's absolutely no reason why the over-the-wire format should change and the AED should change. A notation packet that the application pays attention to achieves all of that. If there's no requirement for actual inability to decrypt, then a notation packet in the signed hashed area, I think achieves all of this. Without you unable to access your data, should you not have the application?
I think for signatures, I think that's the case. I'm not sure that's the case for encryption. Because the concerns on the attacks for encryption is that someone can take a message that was encrypted to you in some other context, feed it into email, and then give it, and then your mail user agent encounters it and does terrible things with it. I think that was the primary place where the encryption. That was why I sort of wanted to separate out context parameters for encryption from context parameters for signing. They behave differently here. And the paper that introduced this was specifically concerned with exfiltration of clear text from encrypted data based on flaws in existing mail user agents.
That's only going to work if either we have a context specified for email, or which is going to be incredibly hard to roll out right across all user agents in an interoperable fashion, or every single application uses a context. And again, if the purpose is the application protects itself against that exploit, then that's something the application can do anyway without actual support from the protocol.
Okay, DKG, do you want to use your super chair-like powers to create a poll or two?
Yeah, I was going to do 2 polls. One is, should we add a context parameter to v6 signatures as in this draft? And then the next one would be, should we add a context parameter to v2 SEIPD in this draft?
And can I suggest a third poll after those two, depending on the answers? Is this a topic the working group should revisit after we're done with the current internet draft? After 48.8 this?
That seems to presuppose what the outcome will be, but I agree if the outcome is
depending on the outcome. But I think it's worth asking, because there is interest in addressing this topic. I think.
Yes.
I think there's concern about whether it's addressable now in the way specified in the merge request. So.
So I'm going to say, should we add a context parameter to v6 signatures in this draft for greenfield application only?
No, wait.
No. Okay. I mean, I'm just trying to understand what the scope is here. I'll say as specified in merge request 214.
So the discussion so far hasn't really touched on that greenfield only for signatures versus existing applications. People were talking about the difficulty with existing applications, or with applications that have gone away.
Right.
If you add greenfield only, I think you confuse me anyway.
Okay. So adding a context parameter as specified in merge request 214 doesn't say anything about what the contents of that context parameter should be.
Yeah, I know.
So should we add a context parameter to v6 signatures in this draft without any specification of its contents, of its value?
That is the proposal in the merge request, right?
That's the proposal in the merge request.
Yeah, so I think that's a good question to ask, and I think the discussion has talked around that topic. So I think that's a good question to ask. So as per the merge request.
Yeah, so should we add a context parameter to v6 signatures in this draft without any specification of its value? Michael Richardson in the chat says, since this is a new version, can't we say that the previous versions have an implicit email context? But Michael, I'm not sure we can say that, because I think OpenPGP has been used for many things other than email, whether it's package signing or backup encryption or other things which are not email.
So I think the chat is starting to revisit the discussion that we've just had. So,
right.
I think we should move to a poll.
Okay, so here's a poll. This is signatures only. Should we add a context parameter to v6 signatures in this draft without any specification of its value?
And raise hand if you think we should, and do not raise hand if you think we should not, and do nothing if you're not sure.
Okay, that got us the most active feedback. We've got 9 responses. It's not 100% one way or the other. We have 2 people saying we should and 7 saying that we should not. I am going to close the poll. And my next poll is, should we add a context to SEIPD to encryption in this draft without any
and again, raise your hand if you think we should do it, and hit do not raise your hand if you think we should not do it, and do nothing if you're not sure.
So it looks like people are probably voting the same way on both of those polls with the same number. Okay, so I'm going to close this poll.
So I think Daniel, I assume, is one of the people who raised his hand for those polls. If the other person would like to speak and hasn't spoken to this already, I think that might be useful information. But if the other person chooses not to, that's fine too. I don't see anybody joining the queue, and just out of curiosity, did anybody change? Did anybody vote differently in the two polls?
I suspect that
Looks like
everyone voted. I think those were the same.
Okay. So yeah, I mean,
Okay.
that's
This is going to be the. Yeah, I will follow up to the list with this discussion.
Could you ask the third poll, which is, does the working group want to address this topic in future after 4880 bis? And raise hand if you think it should be addressed in future, and do not raise hand if you think it should not be.
Okay, so everyone thinks this is worth addressing, but at least of people who are awake, 7 of the 9 think that it probably shouldn't be done as merge request 214 suggests, but everyone does think that it should be addressed at some point by the working group. I'm going to close this poll. Thanks for your feedback, folks. So the poll says this topic, but just for clarity in the notes, this topic means context parameters. I'm going to advance. We've got a few points left. We are over an hour in. The version 5 ECDH PKESK currently has more material in it than is needed. This is a merge request 223, and it basically says, look, in the current approach for ECDH PKESK, we feed some stuff into the key wrap input, which is the symmetric algorithm. The session key itself, or the value that will be used to generate the session key, the 2-octet checksum, and some PKCS1 padding. But ECDH key wrap itself has an implicit checksum because it is because of the way that it's being calculated. The SEIPD version 2 packet, which corresponds to this V5 ECDH PKESK, already has the symmetric algorithm, so that's not actually being hidden, and it's known outside of this. And all session keys are block size, multiples of 8 octets. So there's no need for padding. And so this is saying, look, when we're using the ECDH key wrap, we really don't need to stuff all this other stuff in. We can just make it simpler and put this thing in. It makes the PKESK slightly smaller, more compact, and doesn't introduce room for potential failures there. There's no additional checksum calculation. There's no potential risk for a symmetric algorithm mismatch, and you don't have to worry about the padding. So this is another change on the wire. If we're talking about changing PKESK from V5 to V6, there will be changes on the wire as it is. Again, I hear Stephen's point that this is not necessarily a great reason for making other changes, but this has been proposed. There's a merge request out there. I don't believe the merge request updates the test vectors, which makes it a little bit difficult to evaluate whether people agree on the actual implementation, but I don't think this is a huge change. Have folks had a chance to look at this? Any opinions on it? Anyone speak up? Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, so usually I'm not a huge fan of binding the algorithm specifics to the version of the packet. Like I kind of like having those orthogonal. But that being said, I do like this simplification, and it's uh, much closer to using standard um, key wrap, which actually, okay, it's a bit specific to our use case, but we have AES key wrap implemented in web crypto, but only that we could use with the new format, but we can't with the existing one. And there may be other libraries that offer that, although I'm not sure. So that kind of simplifies using it. So yeah, I would be in favor.
Thanks, Daniel. Eustace, go ahead.
I'm also in favor of the change, and I like that it finds the wrap algorithm with the um, algorithm used in system.
Okay. We've heard two
Just-
people speak.
Can somebody repeat? I didn't catch Justice's point. The audio problems again. DKG, what did you hear?
I heard him say that he was in favor of this change, that he likes the binding of the algorithm in use,
Okay,
and he likes the simplification.
sure, good.
So this, if we make this change, it does seem to bind us to having all session keys for future symmetric algorithms be multiples of A.depth. And it only seems to have an effect for ECDH, not for other public key algorithms. Just want to make sure that folks are aware of that. I don't think that those are dangerous limits, but I want to make sure that people are aware of those consequences. I don't know. Shall I do a poll on this, Stephen? So the poll is, shall we simplify V6 ECDSH PKASK key wrap input? So the poll is in play. Just click raise hands if you agree with the change. Do not raise hand if you object to the change. And do not press if you are not sure. Okay. I'm seeing it stabilize. It's at stabilizing at 5. We have fewer people actively engaged on the question, but it is at least uniform. No one is objecting to the change. So we will add that feedback to the question, follow up on the list, and to the merge request.
We are 90 minutes into the meeting, so I suspect that interest levels will drop away quickly if we don't speed up.
Yep, we have one more question, which is relatively easy for us to deal with, which is the document title. This is a bike shed. That's the image on the slide. The OpenPGP message format is the current title, but it is not just messages. If anybody has a preference, speak up. I'm leaning towards just calling it OpenPGP, unless anybody has a strong preference for one of the other proposals or a different one that's there. Probably the most descriptive one is the longest one here. OpenPGP messages, signatures, keys, and certificates.
Let's bike shed on the list if needed. I think.
Yep, I'm not seeing anybody jumping into the queue, except for some trolling by Michael Richardson.
Okay, let's do it on the list. I don't think it's worth audio time for that discussion.
Yep.
To be honest.
I just wanted to see if anybody had any clear objections, and it doesn't sound like they do. So, if these changes are made as we have decided here, are we done with the working group last call? Will we want to go ahead and ask the editor to make the changes and pass the document to the wider IETF? I'll want to hear some feedback from implementers when the changes are made, I guess, that we think that we have the ability to do it. But I have not heard any additional changes that need to be made. Is there anything that we are missing here with these changes?
Is there anything we're missing that we absolutely need to address? I think is what you mean.
That's what I mean. Yes, thank you.
Not hearing anything. So I guess the plan then would be we'll try to see if Paul has enough cycles to push out a new rev with these changes, actions, then have a short pause for people to check that, and then declare victory. At the working group level, where we push it on to publication requested, it goes to our AD to be reviewed, it goes to the IETF last call, it goes to the ISG, it goes to the RC editor, etc., etc. So.
Yeah. And I want to remind folks that our editor, Paul, is pretty strapped for time. So the more we can offer him concrete merge requests that there is a clear consensus on, the easier it will be, I think, for us as a whole and for him individually. So the more folks can step up and make sure that the merge requests are clean and that they can confirm that the merge requests that they're in favor of are, that they approve of them, that they work, the easier things will be. So, do we need to meet in IETF 116, Yokohama? If we have a new draft out before then, we could potentially use a meeting in Yokohama to deal with feedback that's come from the rest of the IETF, if there is any. We could potentially use it. Steven's saying no.
That won't have happened. The IETF last call won't have started before Yokohama because that requires the new rev and AD review to have happened.
Okay.
So we won't be at IETF last call in Yokohama. Yeah, but the question nonetheless is, do we want to meet? I mean, there are a couple of people who want to do post-quantum things. We talked about context parameters. There's a bunch of things people might want to do. I think DKG and I had a call yesterday where we basically said we have to make a request for a meeting slot by tomorrow.
Yep.
It seems to make sense to assume that there's enough interest in rechartering to do those kind of the known things that people want to do to make it, it seems to justify a meeting, unless a bunch of people are going to say now that they either won't be physically present or can't participate because of time zones or something. So does anybody want to argue for not meeting, or does anybody want to argue for meeting? Paco.
Yeah, I would like to argue for meeting to address next chart at work, specifically PQC, post-quantum cryptography. We have a draft out in the name of Aaron, and as soon as the working group is done so far with the changes to this draft, I think it could be interesting to turn to that in order to prepare already the minds and generate some ideas on it. So far, we didn't receive much feedback, and we hope that could improve.
Cool. So can I suggest that we'd like to get done with 4880 bis, so I don't want to disturb that. So maybe just for the moment, if you have items that you would like to suggest for rechartering, if you drop a mail to the chairs, we'll collate those. And in the next kind of few weeks before Yokohama, we'll at some point kind of post to the list to list those things that people have suggested. Is that okay, DKG?
Yep. Sounds
Okay,
like
so if you
a
have
good
things you
plan.
want to include in a recharter, drop it to the chairs of mail. We'll collate them, and when we think it's not going to distract 4880 bis, we'll take that to the list.
Okay. That's the end of what we have scheduled for the agenda today, and we are close to the limit on time, but we'll give you back at least 20 minutes.
Unless there's any other business. Does anybody have any other business? Neil, Daniel?
I just noticed
Yeah.
that the designated expert discussion didn't happen. Is that right? And there is a point on the agenda.
That's
yeah,
correct.
sorry about that.
Very well spotted.
219.
Thank you. That is my mistake. I screwed up the slides and lost track. So I posted a draft of designated revoker guidance to the list, and Paul sort of picked it apart. My goal of posting it was not that I thought what I'd written was perfect, but was just to try to get people talking. So Paul at least had some critique, if not concrete suggestions. It'd be great if folks could weigh in on what they think is the right thing there.
So okay. So I think that the outcome there is just let's take that to the list and discuss there.
But Neil, do you have a specific concern about designated revoker or the discussion that's happening there on the list already?
No, just I'm typing the notes and noticed that we skipped a whole paragraph.
Thank you
Neil,
for
thank you for the
watching
excellent
that.
notes. They really look good.
Much appreciated.
Daniel,
you're in the queue too?
Yeah, I completely unrelated, but since Michael brought it up in the chat, and I thought of, well, the other thing is that Werner's new draft that I think he published this week rips out EAX, I think, and purely from a perspective of if we're looking at the differences between Werner's draft and the crypto refresh, and if at some point we have to justify those differences and what we put in the RFC, then it might become difficult to justify having 3 AAD modes, right? And on GCM, there has been a lot of discussion, and
Daniel, your audio dropped out for a second.
okay, sorry about that. So I was saying that for GCM, we had concrete discussion and concrete reasons to put it in. And I think for OCB, there's also, we discussed making that mandatory to implement and so on. And I think we had reasons for that. But I don't think we ever really discussed EX or any reasons for having it there. So I know it's very late in the process, as you said, but I guess I would, just voicing out loud the question of, do we need it? Should we rip it out?
So I guess again, that's probably one to take to the list. I mean, I think, it is late. Even if people have relatively good ideas at this point, we might be better off not actioning them. That's a possibility. But by all means, bring it to the list. The other point I would make is that kind of raises the prospect of the working group being vulnerable to a denial of service attack if changes are made to Werner's draft proximate to the working group meeting. and then we react to those every time, then we never get finished. I'm not saying that Werner is trying to do that. I'm just saying that, making reactive changes in that way could expose us to that risk. So I guess probably one to bring to the list, I think. DKG?
I'm not. I don't know that I have a particular perspective on that. I am worried about the about terminating, but I agree that a simpler draft, and it is marginally simpler without EAX, is probably a little bit easier to review. There certainly are fewer test vectors to verify if you remove one of the axes of variation. But I don't really have a, and we have reserved code points in there for things that have been specified in the past that are no longer advisable. So it could be doable, but if you're going to propose it, I would hope that you make it clear what the specific changes are. The easiest thing to do there would be, if you think it's a good idea and you want to push for it, have a very clear merge request that people could consider.
So if you think it's a good idea, and a good idea to do it right now, with the risk that we get stuck and never finish, because that's a real risk. So I think there should be a pretty high bar for even deletions at this point.
Yeah, I don't want to spend 2 months arguing back and forth about whether or not to rip something out. That certainly is not a useful thing.
So Daniel, please weigh in your mind how important such a merge request would be versus the possibility that the working group fails to finish again.
Well, I wasn't necessarily saying we should do it, right? It was just a question, not necessarily a proposal. I mean, I can propose it to the list if you want.
No. Yeah, please don't propose it unless you're absolutely convinced that we want to do it. We want to do it now. It's not going to screw up and cause us not to finish.
I'm not convinced. It was just a question. So I'm also happy to drop it if you prefer. Or, I mean, we can do a poll or whatever, but...
No. I don't think we should be doing polls for, here's the thing we might do, should we do it? It's too dangerous that we end up with people saying, oh yeah, that's a good idea, and then we end up not finishing at all. This working group has been through this like 5 years ago or whatever it was.
Well,
we have already got some fork of the kind of draft versus Werner's. We really should get finished.
Yes. I mean, if we want to do it, I'm happy to make a merge request with a concrete proposal and push that forward. I don't want to do that if we don't want to do it.
I'm going to posit that we don't want to do it.
Yeah, I would say that you should only be proposing changes that at this point you should only propose changes that you think are that you strongly believe in. You should if you're going to propose a change, you should have you should be convinced that it should happen.
Now, and with the risks associated.
Now, and you should be convinced that you will be able to have this discussion and it will conclude in a very short period of time.
I'm not very strongly convicted on it. The only point is that I see a risk.
So Daniel, if you're not convinced, I think we're done.
Okay. Can I just say I see a risk of, if we keep it, that there will be a lot of discussion even later about, do we really, why did they put in 3 AAD modes, and then it becomes an issue once we want to make an RFC. But if you don't think that's a risk, then I'm happy to drop it.
I'm happy you're happy to drop it.
Okay.
I don't think that we're going to get pushback saying, given that there's a registry there, I don't think we're going to get pushback saying, why would you have added EAX here? We have historical reasons for having added it. And, there's a registry, somebody could re-specify EAX. It's not, I don't think we're going to get pushback that says there's too many modes here.
Okay.
Okay.
I think we're done. Let's not break being done. If there's something to bring to the list, bring it to the list by all means, please. But again, only if you're convinced it really needs to happen. It really needs to happen now. It doesn't cause a risk of the working group never finishing, because those are real. Yep. That's a real risk.
Okay, but please take your feelings on this stuff to the list. We do want to make sure, even if your feelings are like, yeah, I'm glad we're doing this. Let's move it along. This is the right thing. Confirmation on the list that shows that there is active participation. You can say, yeah, I checked these test vectors against my implementation, and they check out. All of that kind of confirmation is valuable on the list and moves us in the direction of completion. So please do weigh in that way. We can't wait indefinitely on each open question, and having clear answers lets us say, we can move ahead with this, or we can not. So thank you all. We will take next steps, and Neil, thank you specifically for taking those notes. That's much appreciated.
Indeed. Yep. Thanks for coming, and Neil. Since you took such good notes, Neil, you get one last go with the mic.
I just want to say you're welcome. You said thank you. I said you're welcome.
Excellent. You want to watch out. You're going to be recruited again. Good stuff. We'll take it to the list. The minutes will be posted there, and we'll organize Yokohama and the rest of the stuff. So thank you, and thanks for bearing with us for an hour and 3/4. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Does anything have to happen with those notes, or
we can take it out? Neil, thanks very much. I'll have a quick flick over them, and then there's a button to press to publish them. But I think that's all we need. They look super good.
I just didn't want them to get lost.
No,
they're
typing. Yeah.
Okay.
DKG's gone too. Okay. All right. Bye-bye.